All right, AP Stats, we're finishing off section 401 today. A lot of terminology in this section. Let's see, we've talked about a population and a sample. We've talked about a census. We've talked about bad ways to get a sample, voluntary response sampling, and convenience sampling. Those are bad ways to get samples because we won't get a group that represents the entire population. And if you leave people out of the population and you're a little more heavy on a certain kind of person from the population, then you're systematically favoring certain outcomes. And that means your data is a waste of time. It won't represent the population. And so when you go to say you found something true about the population, you look like an idiot. Then we found out three different ways to take a good sample. The simple random sample, SRS. The stratified sample, where you take SRSs from certain groups because you want to have certain groups represented. And the cluster sample, where in the natural order of things, your population is already kind of grouped. And so you randomly just pick groups and you interview everybody in the group. Okay, bias. Bias, as a definition we learned, is systematically favoring certain outcomes. A bias in your data means your data is off because you didn't take a good sample. You systematically favored a certain outcome. Well, here's a summary of how bias can show up in the study. Definition, the sampling frame. The sampling frame is how you go about getting your sample. Like, how did you collect all of the individuals in the population? It's the organized structure for the population from which you use chance to obtain your sample. Like if I went and got a list of every student ID at Canelan High School, that would be my sampling frame. Or I got all the social security numbers from the state of Illinois because I wanted to look at something about every resident of Illinois. That would be my sampling frame. The next one, a sampling error, a sampling mistake. Bias shows up in my data. It's an introduction of bias in your sample as a result of your choice of sampling design. You done messed up. If you chose to do a volunteer response sample, you're going to have bias in your data. That's a sampling error. That's your fault. This one is without question your fault. Now, that's not the only way you can have bias in your data. There's also something called a non-sampling error. What that means is it's not your fault. It's not the way you designed it. It's an introduction of big bad bias into your sample as a result of some outside source. Like your respondents lying when you ask them questions, or refusing to participate, or something similar. Some way that they couldn't make themselves available even though you thought they could. Here are the 4 types of bias that we have. You're going to want to definitely spend some time with these. You'll get scenarios and you'll have to pick what kind of bias it is. Okay, an undercoverage bias. This is where certain individuals are left out of the sample because of the sampling design. That's a sampling error. That is your fault for sure. Undercoverage is you went to do your sample and you left people out. If I only asked students in my statistics classes and pre-calculus classes questions about standards-based grading, I would be leaving freshmen out. We would have an undercoverage bias. I mean, does anybody really care about them anyway? A non-response bias. Individuals selected, they just don't cooperate. You send out a survey, they don't answer it. This is not your fault, or they can't be reached, so they're left out of the sample. If they're left out, there's bias because we systematically favored the people who are there. But that is not your fault. It's a non-sampling error. Doesn't mean bias isn't there. It's just whose responsibility is it? A response bias. Well, here's where individuals don't answer truthfully. Now, why would anybody not answer truthfully? Maybe the questions I'm asking the Canelan High School students are, have you consumed any alcohol over the last 3 weekends? I'm pretty sure everybody's going to say no to that, whether it's true or not, and so that would be a response bias. I don't have truth in my data because people didn't feel comfortable telling the truth. Badly worded questions. The way the question is written or asked. Maybe somebody gives it away in the way they're asking it. It leads individuals towards certain responses. That one is definitely your fault as well. If you ask questions like this, my name is Larson and I love standards-based grading. It's my favorite thing. I believe that it's going to lead us to the promised land of education. By breaking these standards down and giving students 1 through 3s or 4s, I really feel like we've had a breakthrough here. Now, let me ask you, how do you feel about standards-based grading? Now, if I do that, I have just walked somebody right into saying yes. I led them toward a certain answer. And if I do that, it's a badly worded question, and it creates a response bias, really, because they don't tell the truth, even though you led them there, right? This one kind of creates that one. But this one would be your fault. Okay, there's your 4 different kinds of bias, and there's a little bit of terminology setting them up. Let's go to the next page.